If you wanted someone removed from the planet quietly, it would cost you about $5,000. But during World War II, Adolf Hitler spent over $5 trillion. That's so much money to put a bounty on over 1 billion people and have them all assassinated. But the craziest thing about World War II is that it's not even the most expensive war in history. It's actually not even close. If you look back in time, there are wars that make World War II look cheap. So let's go find the most expensive war to ever happen. Starting in the early 2000s with a global conflict that revolutionized the destruction industry, Iraqi War. At its peak, the United States was spending over $2 billion a week in Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power. And over time, the total cost of the war, including military operations, reconstruction, and long-term veteran care, has been estimated at over $3 trillion, with long-term obligations pushing that figure higher. So on paper, it's not even beating Hitler in raw dollars. But unlike most wars in this video, which were paid for with higher taxes or seized assets, the Iraq War was largely financed through deficit spending. And the United States will finish paying for it in 2052. So the Iraq War wasn't the most expensive war in history overall, but in absolute modern dollars and long-term regional damage, it remains one of the costliest conflicts of our era. But let's go back in time to find a very different kind of cost. It's the year 1945. World War II has just ended. Cities are rebuilding, factories are restarting, and the world is trying to recover. But it's in these ruins that we find one of the most expensive wars in history, the Cold War. Both the USSR and the United States had emerged as the global superpowers after defeating Nazi Germany, but they weren't interested in open battle. So, after they met in Potsdam to discuss the post-war strategies with President Harry Truman quietly flexing his new atomic weapon, they agreed not to fight, but neither side trusted the other. So they both went home, and soon after, the world witnessed a display of power like nothing ever seen before. But this power was never meant to be used. During the Cold War, there were no massive invasions, no single battlefield, no cities being flattened overnight. In fact, there were no daily headlines of total destruction or a timeline. It relied on pressure, nuclear stockpiles, proxy wars, the space race, and entire economies built around a war that might never come. The United States and the Soviet Union spent decades preparing to destroy each other without ever pulling the trigger. So despite having no single moment of collapse, the Cold War consumed over $30 trillion in resources. And at its peak, the United States and the Soviet Union had over 60,000 nuclear warheads combined, enough to destroy human civilization multiple times over. See, in order to find the most expensive war in history, we need to think bigger than just dollars. Whether it be military spending or human loss or economic reset, and in the end, only one will be determined as the most expensive war in history. So let's move on to the next contender, to the year 1803. If we are looking for wars that cost the most money, the Napoleonic Wars segment is perfect because it looks small on paper, until you adjust it to modern money and realize Europe basically set its wallet on fire for 20 years straight. So, just how much did it cost? Well, Britain didn't just fight Napoleon, but they paid everyone else to fight him, licking dry all their treasuries and mints until their national debt exploded to over 250% of their GDP, a level so extreme it wouldn't be seen again until the World Wars. On the other hand, France simply funded its war through looting conquered territories, forcing allies to pay contributions and heavy domestic taxation. At one point, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States when he needed the money so badly until only a fraction of his army of 600,000 soldiers returned either frozen, starved, or collapsed. And these were defeated by the Russian defense for about $1,627. No. Like, for real. Since Russia's defensive war against Napoleon was patriotic, most of its funding came from private donations and noblemen who often donated entire regiments of tens of thousands of horses. The Russians also practiced scorched earth, the strategic destruction of Russian infrastructure and crops to deny Napoleon supplies, representing immense loss of national net worth. Although on paper, the mobilization of 600,000 soldiers by Russia in the Napoleonic Wars eventually amassed to only $1,600 in their time, in today's worth, Well, it's a little over $300 billion, even though it doesn't beat Putin's war in Ukraine in raw dollars. Adjusted for scale, the Napoleonic Wars were $1 trillion warfare before $1 trillion economies existed, fought with wood, iron, and gunpowder. But Napoleon's success was only possible thanks to the men who came before him in the year 1492. The Mona Lisa, whiskey, and caravel boats are being invented. 3 conquistadors would define this century. The first was Christopher Columbus, who begged European rich men to sponsor his voyage across the Atlantic, but only to send a report of gold and natives ready to serve. The next was Hernán Cortés, who toppled the mighty Aztec Empire in 1521. With a few hundred men, thousands of indigenous allies, these men fought a brutal war of treasures for over 2 years straight, costing the indigenous people over $500 billion today. Hernán Cortés sailed back to Spain with 2 ships of gold filled to the brim after causing so much damages and diseases. By the time he left the Americas, smallpox was becoming a pandemic across the continent. And when Francisco Pizarro came and captured the Inca emperor in 1532, he took a room-filling ransom of gold and silver, which unlocked Peru's riches worth trillions of dollars today. These men set in motion the Spanish extraction machine with thousands of conquistadors that caused mass forced labor, population collapse that destroyed 90% of the Americas' population in several places, massive silver looting to a point where Spain had hyperinflation of up to 400%. So the Spanish conquests stand as perhaps the most expensive war. It is the most profitable war for the winner and the most expensive war for the loser in human history, delivering over $15 to $40 trillion in wealth transfer. But to find the most expensive war to ever happen, we may have to go even further back in time. In 1206, Genghis founded the Mongol Empire. He quickly curb-stomped his competitors through innovation and screwing them over, and by the 1270s, he controlled 90% of Asia's steppes. But his empire fell in 1368 when rebellions declared the Mongols an illegal horde and ordered it to be broken up into successor states. This internal punishment destroyed Genghis's legacy and he ended up dying in exile. Just kidding. After the breakup, his descendants had control in each of the new khanates and their conquest values soared, making the empire richer than ever before. The rebellions resulted in the Mongols becoming the world's largest land empire, and at its peak in 1279, it was worth 22% of the world's total mass land. But land wasn't the real cost. The Mongols are responsible for one of the deadliest periods in human history, killing 60 million people, which was 15% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities and cultures were erased. The Islamic Golden Age came to an end. Industrial centers like the Song Dynasty, which controlled up to 30 to 40% of global wealth, similar to the United States today, were destroyed and replaced by a nomadic system.
Jesus Christ has no advantage over Genghis Khan.
History repeats itself. And yet the Mongols had one advantage. They ran the most cost-efficient army in history. Each soldier had 3 to 5 horses, living off the land. So there were basically no supply chains or salaries, because the army funded itself through plunder. And if converted into modern terms, the total damage ranges from $30 trillion to over $100 trillion. New York City is worth around $3 trillion. The Mongols didn't just destroy one New York, they destroyed 30. In a wave of fire that crossed continents, making it potentially the most expensive war in history. But before the hordes, there was an empire that bankrolled entire regions. The year is 509 BC. America doesn't exist yet. Life expectancy is brutal. There's no electricity and no world economy to measure anything against. In a small city on the Tiber, Rome is born, working its way up from being a local bully to being a Mediterranean machine. Then over the next few centuries, Rome launches a conquest of legions, destroying and looting cities across all the 4 cardinals. At its height, Rome maintained an army of roughly 300,000 hardcore invincible soldiers sent thousands of miles away from Rome itself. And before the invention of the telephone, Rome solves the same problem every empire has. They built a massive network of roads 500,000 kilometers long, meaning orders, armies, and taxes would move faster than ever. But Rome has one serious problem. A conquest empire so massive is expensive to maintain. Because unlike others in this list, who was defeated by just a 2-front war? Well, Rome was able to sustain over 4 war fronts at the same time, spreading through Carthage war elephants in Africa and through Jerusalem as far as Iran. And all these frontiers never stop eating money. So Rome does what Rome always does. It makes the conquered pay for the conquest through tribute, taxes, loot, slaves, which is why the cost of Roman expansion is kind of weird. Because unlike most wars, Rome often financed itself by winning. So Rome wasn't the most expensive war in one single decade, but as a 700-year conquest engine that absorbed provinces, redirected trade, and turned entire regions into supply lines, its true cost was not a bill. It was a world system worth $70 trillion in modern-day expenses. But let's go even further back in time. Civilization is still in its early stages. Most people live short, very, very difficult lives. There are no global economies or banks, so each city controls its own grain, metal, and its own army. A single war could consume everything a civilization had, and building a fortified city would take decades of thousands of manpower. In Mesopotamia, Sargon of Akkad rises to power, and war for resources like food is constant. Creating a chariot was like building a fighter jet of the ancient world. And at his peak, with fleets of war chariots, Sargon of Akkad unleashed massive wars, worth billions in today's dollars. But that number doesn't really mean anything, because back then, if you lost a war, you lost your entire future and history. He created the first multi-ethnic empire in history. But when we go this far back, the details get murky. Written records are limited and often unreliable. The true cost of these wars will never really be known, so what was the most expensive war in history? Looking at these numbers, it seems like there are a lot of wars that make World War II look small. But these numbers don't tell the whole story. Hear me out. Modern wars look expensive because we measure them in money, but ancient wars were expensive because they erased entire civilizations. And when a war destroys the people, the workforce, and the future, there's no number big enough to measure it. So even though the Mongol conquests may have caused more devastation for their time, they were still operating in a much smaller world. World War II was something else entirely. The biggest nations, in the biggest global economy in history, all fighting at the same time, at the biggest stage of strategy, the biggest war in the biggest system. And because of that, World War II is the most expensive war in human history. And eventually, another war will surpass it in the future too.